Siempre Cuba ha estado luchando por su libertad.
Murieron 100,000 personas. No pudo triunfar, pero cambió el país.
There is little question that Meyer Lansky had thoroughly corrupted Batista.
It's not a lie. They didn't promise anything. They promised a revolution. They did a revolution.
Эти ребята обязательно будут либо мучениками, либо национальными героями.
Una revolución.
Fidel Castro.
And he told Khrushchev, you should unleash the entire Soviet nuclear arsenals. Apocalypse.
Kuba lässt sich nicht in die Knie zwingen.
Cuba has come a long way. From island paradise in the Caribbean, over 400 years of colonial occupation, to being the lone outpost of socialism in the Western Hemisphere. Revolutionary leader Fidel Castro has led the country for half a century. Everyday life on Cuba is focused on him, his maxims, and his cult of personality. But behind this static facade, a transformation is underway. Why did secret agents become one of the island's most important sources of income? How did the Pope manage to mediate between Cuba and its sworn enemy, the United States? And what will happen after the Castros? The history of Cuba is 500 years of poverty and insurrection, and a dream of freedom that the Cubans have never given up on. During the Cold War, Cuba was firmly on the side of the Soviet Union. Education and health were positive aspects of the Castro era.
Kuba ist das erste Land Lateinamerikas, das Schulbildung sozusagen für alle durchgehend, freien Universitätszugang, Gesundheit für alle gehabt hat.
The demise of the Soviet Union and its satellite states in the early 1990s hit Cuba hard. Economic support worth billions of dollars suddenly disappeared. Cuba's infrastructure collapsed, and even basic food items were suddenly in short supply. Any opposition to the regime was repressed.
La mayor parte de la gente en Cuba ya no cree en ese sistema. Ya saben que eso no llega a ninguna parte. Después de 56 años hay que ser un imbécil para creer que eso puede funcionar.
Many disenfranchised Cubans decided to flee the island. Among them is Elena Fernandez Revuelta, Fidel Castro's illegitimate daughter. Foregoing a privileged life among Castro's inner circle, she fled Cuba with a fake Spanish passport in 1993. Seeking refuge in the United States, she immediately spoke out against her father's regime.
Il y a le gouvernement qui vole. Peut-être pour garder, puis après soulager. Ça arrive. C'est arrivé pendant 35 ans. Donc, le gouvernement trouvera un moyen, je suis sûre, d'essayer de subsister. Mais évidemment, ça ne va pas durer.
But unlike Elena, most people did not have the option to flee Cuba. On August 5th, 1994, anti-Castro demonstrations erupt in central Havana. The events may seem small, but it's the first time under Fidel Castro's rule that public anger has manifested in the streets. But even so, anti-Fidel protesters are immediately confronted by pro-Fidel sympathizers and the police.
Das sind die ersten schweren Unruhen nach Ausbruch der ganz, ganz schweren Krise. Also 92, 93 war wirklich Kuba am absoluten Tiefpunkt.
One trigger for the protests was the opening of a new kind of store in Cuba in the early 1990s. These stores catered only to tourists and Cubans with relatives abroad because they only accepted US dollars. The majority of the population could only watch in envy.
Esos fueron jóvenes que querían irse y se tiraron por la calle a protestar. Y yo me quiero ir y me dejan ir. Fidel fue a hablar con ellos. Llegó ahí, habló con ellos. ¿Qué es lo que ustedes quieren? Irnos. Ya, bueno, pues arranquen, váyanse.
The distance between Cuba and the United States is a scant 90 miles. It may not seem like much, but there are no ferries and no other boats available to most Cubans. After Fidel Castro granted his permission to people wishing to leave Cuba, tens of thousands took to the sea in flimsy, handmade rafts and boats. They were called balseros, rafters. Many of them told their stories in the Catalan Oscar-nominated documentary of the same name.
Yo creo que es esta manifestación la que genera eso. Y que Cuba necesitaba, siempre ha utilizado, cuando digo Cuba me refiero al gobierno. El gobierno cubano siempre ha necesitado abrir esa válvula de escape. Cuando la situación se pone muy tensa, abre la válvula y deja salir la gente.
Castro told his police not to oppose any attempts to leave the country. Most of those fleeing underestimated the difficulties of navigating on the open ocean. Without help, they had little chance to make it to the United States.
I had an airplane at the time, which I used to go to the Bahamas. It was a plaything, a hobby. We flew quite a lot to determine several things.
With a group of amateur pilots, Jose Basulto founded the aid association Brothers to the Rescue.
1994 was an avalanche. Before 1994, we had found 4,200 refugees at sea. In 1994, we assisted the Coast Guard to find 35,000 more.
Rafts were identified from the air, and their positions radioed to the Coast Guard, who intercepted the rafts. The rafters were brought by Coast Guard ships to Guantanamo Bay, where they were registered before being sent to the U.S. Together, the U.S. Coast Guard and Brothers to the Rescue saved thousands of lives. The exodus did not last long before Cuba once again closed access to the Malecon.
Fidel ist dann persönlich auch auf dem Malecon mit seinem Gefolge langmarschiert, diese Fläche wieder, diesen öffentlichen Raum wieder in Besitz zu nehmen und zu zeigen, hier ist alles unter Kontrolle.
In 1994, Cuba was in the midst of an economic crisis. Tourism on the island mainly benefited the army, securing its financial survival. To find new sources of income, Cuba began selling secrets collected by its spy services.
For decades, essentially up through 1995, the Cubans were almost perfect in the United States. Because they had been so successful for so long, they stopped being creative. They became predictable. And in the spy services, being predictable is fatal.
In 1985, the Cuban Intelligence Service recruited the services of American Ana Montes. She then applied to join the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. As a double agent, she helped the Cuban Intelligence Service identify several American spies while still working for the DIA. In Washington, Montez was regarded as an expert on Cuba and acted as a consultant on Cuban affairs to various politicians. It took a slip-up during a routine interview to unmask her as a double agent. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison.
In most cases, when you're running a spy, the spy is simply there to steal their secrets. Ana Montez was much more than that. She actually helped shape U.S. policy on Cuba. One of her nicknames was the Queen of Cuba. When they lost her, they lost a lot.
Cuba's economic situation remained desperate until a new potential backer appeared on the world stage. Cuban intelligence began working in Venezuela.
Dann kam 1999 als neuer Retter Hugo Chavez und hat die Rolle übernommen, die vorher die Sowjetunion gespielt hat. Nun nicht mit den ideologischen Zwängen, aber doch zumindest mit der materiellen Basis, indem er Öl geliefert hat, indem er vor allen Dingen auch viele Milliarden in dieses Land gesteckt hat.
Like Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez was a socialist and also, like him, a fervent opponent of U.S. influence in Latin America. In 2002, more than 1,000 Cuban agents helped put down an anti-Chavez coup from within the country's army.
Chavez hat den Castro dann einigermaßen berechtigt sozusagen zum Vater der lateinamerikanischen, sprich venezolanischen Revolution ernannt.
Relations between Venezuela and Cuba intensified. Cuba sent teachers and doctors and spies to help repress any opposition to Chavez. In exchange, Venezuela delivered oil.
Wobei man wissen muss, dass eben in Kuba die Energiebasis nicht stimmt. Das ist einfach das Erdöl, was man dort findet, ist zu wenig und die Kraftwerke sind auch zusammengebrochen. Also man brauchte eine neue Energiebasis und dabei hat Venezuela mitgeholfen.
Hugo Chavez treated Castro like a Venezuelan elder statesman. Chavez even ruled his country while living in Cuba for months on end. Its oil made Venezuela rich and financed both Venezuela's and Cuba's socialism. Cuba received $1.5 billion worth of oil per year. It sold half on the international market, generating profits in excess of $800 million a year. Even today, the Cuban intelligence service is very active in Venezuela. They help to counter the political opposition in exchange for the government's ongoing support for Cuba.
But they still have thousands of officers, and as long as those officers are in place, and I mean, frankly, the current Venezuelan leader owes his survival to the Cubans. He's in no position to force the Cubans out, and they have no interest in leaving.
Despite Venezuela's support, however, Cuba's supply situation remained critical. Fidel Castro and his propaganda sought to blame everyone else, and particularly the USA.
Er war der unumstrittene Machthaber in Kuba. Er war der Vater der Nation, anerkannt. Wenn er irgendwo auftrat, gab es Beifall und Fidel, Fidel-Rufe aus dem Publikum. Also das war schon eindeutig, er war der eindeutige Führer.
Cuba's army controlled 40% of its economy. The profits were used to finance the military apparatus. The people of Cuba received almost nothing. The government ensured that the military and secret services maintained their position of power. Real private enterprise and political parties remained banned.
Also es hat immer Widerstand gegeben, aber das war mehr ein intellektueller Widerstand, der sich in Zeitschriften ausgedrückt hat, oder Kritik geübt hat. Es hat aber keinen organisierten Widerstand, so gut wie keinen organisierten Widerstand gegeben.
One exception to this were youth groups within the Catholic Church, which had always demanded human rights and free elections. One of them, a young man named Osvaldo Paya, even founded a Christian liberation movement, the MCL. But even before, Paya was seen as a troublemaker by the regime. During his mandatory military service, he refused to transport political prisoners and was promptly arrested.
Cuando mi papá tenía 17 años, fue secuestrado y enviado a campos de trabajo forzado, como muchos otros muchachos en la época que eran perseguidos por escuchar rock, por escuchar a los Beatles, por tener el pelo largo, por ser homosexuales, por tener cualquier tipo de creencia religiosa, por ir a la iglesia, por no participar del régimen.
What set Paya apart is that he always condemned the United States' Cuban policy. But his criticism and opposition work also stayed within Cuban law.
Nosotros decimos que cada cubano tenga su propia voz y que el pueblo tenga voz en elecciones libres y mediante un parlamento que pueda quitar y poner con un sistema pluralista.
Paya knew that his demands were not possible within the framework of Cuba's socialist constitution. But he saw a legal way out. Under Cuban law, there is the possibility of holding a national referendum that could change the law. All he had to do was gather at least 10,000 signatures.
Por eso hicimos el proyecto Varela, que es la vía por la que los cubanos reclaman sus derechos, nosotros, protagonistas de nuestra historia.
Paya's MCL movement called for freedom of opinion, freedom of the press, free elections, and free market enterprise. They had little trouble collecting the required 10,000 signatures. The government, however, refused to hold the now required referendum. The issue of the Varela project was taken up when former U.S. President Jimmy Carter visited Cuba in 2002.
I don't know what's going to happen with the Varela project. I think it would be very good if your officials would decide to publish the entire document. Let there be a free and open debate in Cuba.
Fidel Castro's response? A crackdown on the opposition. In 2003, he had 75 members of Paya's movement and other opposition groups arrested.
Un mensaje para los cubanos. Un mensaje de terror que fue entendido por el pueblo cubano para decirles, aquí mandamos nosotros. No vayan a pensar que pueden ustedes, cubanos, cambiar las cosas.
They received very long sentences, some of them 25, 28 years. They all went off to jails. Generally, they tried to put them as far away from their family as possible to make it very difficult for them to be visited.
The charges? Conspiring with American diplomats and treason. Osvaldo Paya was not arrested, but his initiative had failed.
Das war, glaube ich, eine weitere Perversion dieser Revolution, also in dieser Form durch eine quasi Hexenjagd gegen die Opposition vorzugehen und dann sie vor allen Dingen durch Schnellgerichte zu derartigen Haftstrafen zu verurteilen, was nun wirklich außerhalb jeglicher rechtlichen Norm war.
Relatives of the arrested dissidents formed a new protest movement. They called themselves Ladies in White. They protested the unjust arrests and demanded freedom for their relatives.
Mi padre llevaba años recibiendo amenazas de muerte por parte de la seguridad del Estado. Y no solo amenazas de muerte, también intentos de atentados.
On July 22, 2012, Osvaldo Paya died in a car crash. The Cuban police claimed that the car carrying 4 passengers was speeding and crashed into a tree. The driver and the passenger in the front seat survived. They were traveling from Havana to Bayamo when the accident happened. At first, they claimed to have been hit by a truck, but retracted their statements in front of television cameras later on. Osvaldo Paya and his group's youth movement leader, Harold Cepero, were both killed in the accident. The driver, a Spanish politician named Angel Caramero, was arrested for involuntary manslaughter. Osvaldo Paya's funeral was attended by tens of thousands of Cubans. His family is convinced his death was orchestrated by the government. Shortly after the funeral, the driver, Angel Caramero, was sentenced to 4 years in prison for allegedly speeding and using his cell phone while driving.
Un juicio lleno de mentiras y de falsedades que concluyó con una condena a este muchacho que iba manejando.
After his release, Angel Caramero claimed on American television that there had been no accident at all.
Yo creo que murieron después porque no hubo ningún accidente. Tan solo nos sacaron de la carretera, no íbamos a velocidad excesiva, no hubo el árbol con el que dice el régimen que nos chocamos. Cuando a mí me cogen preso, me meten en un calabozo en Bayamo, yo no tengo acceso a un abogado, no tengo acceso a nadie, salvo a los militares que me están custodiando. Los militares me fuerzan a grabar un vídeo propio de Al Qaeda. Si ven el vídeo, salgo con la cara amoratada, me cuesta hablar, con un fondo de unas cortinas, leyendo un mensaje que ellos querían que dijera. Era dos opciones, o hacer lo que me pedían o no volver.
Después de hablar todo esto, Ángel, ¿tú estás todavía bajo arresto?
Is Caramero telling the truth, or did he really lose control of the rental car? The Cuban authorities stuck with their version, but doubts and contradictions linger.
Yo creo que mi padre fue un objetivo del gobierno cubano desde el principio. El gobierno cubano simplemente estaba esperando la oportunidad.
Fidel Castro claimed that Paya was in the pay of the U.S. government, but never offered any proof. However, the United States continued to be his nemesis, and, according to him, the cause of all of Cuba's problems. In particular, Castro saw the U.S. Navy base at Guantanamo Bay as a constant provocation. U.S. soldiers have been stationed here without interruption since 1903.
Aux yeux des Cubains, il est clair que c'est le clou dans le pied du Christ, si vous voulez. C'est-à-dire, il y a des Américains armés qui sont implantés sur le territoire de Cuba.
September 11, 2001, changed the balance of world politics. The United States sought allies in their war on terror. How would Cuba and Castro react?
Castro hat den Terrorismus verurteilt, ganz eindeutig, sich davon distanziert, aber auch gleichzeitig gesagt, wir wollen auch keinen Krieg, der daraus folgt. Also no al terrorismo, no a la guerra. Ich weiß noch ganz genau, diese Worte fielen.
The USA invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, hunting down al-Qaeda terrorists. But it was unclear which of the many suspects were actual terrorists at all. Almost all suspected high-level enemy combatants were held at Guantanamo Bay on Cuba. Since the base was not part of U.S. territory, U.S. armed forces and the CIA could operate outside of the restrictions of U.S. domestic law. This posed no problem for the Cuban government.
Raúl ist von Journalisten gefragt worden, was halten Sie denn davon? Er sagte, wir sind gefragt worden.
Soon, the first accusations of torture and prisoner abuse emerged from Guantanamo. Despite international protests, the prison was not shut down under U.S. President Barack Obama. Of more than 800 prisoners here, most were let go over the years. But the fact remains that the United States, who have always accused Cuba of human rights violations, did themselves violate international law in a military base on Cuban soil. Castro's regime exploited the situation and regularly denounced the crimes committed at Guantanamo. For them, it was another way of turning attention away from Cuba's own problems. Unknown to most Cubans, meanwhile, Fidel Castro lived with his family in his well-guarded luxury residence at Punto Cero.
Habíamos ahí alrededor de unos 200 hombres, 200 oficiales adjudicado a la protección directa de Fidel Castro, sin contar otros tipos de unidades que se suman a la protección de Fidel Castro, donde se mueve mucha logística.
The Castro's family compound was conceived as wholly self-sufficient because Fidel feared being poisoned.
Ahí la alimentación sale toda de ahí, lo que es la parte agrícola. Hay unos oficiales que atienden lo que es, eso se le llamaba el hidropónico. Ahí están las vacas para su leche, las chivas para su leche, las búfalas para su leche. Todo estaba ahí, sus vegetales diarios. Es un hombre muy disciplinado, fue un hombre muy disciplinado para comer. Tenía 2 cocineros, 24 horas, 2 empleadas en la casa. El señor, todo estaba al alcance y todo estaba bajo la protección de lo que eran los oficiales de Punto Cero.
Aside from Punto Cero, Fidel Castro also owns a small vacation island near the Bay of Pigs called Cayo Piedra. But the Maximo leader himself does not live a life of luxury. He instead lives under a regime of the highest levels of security. His occasional public appearances, where he loved to be a man of the people, were a nightmare for his security apparatus. The Castro brothers' real wealth lies in the almost unlimited power they wield over the island. Juan Almeida, himself the son of a revolutionary commander, grew up within the Castro's inner circle.
La diferencia está en el poder. El poder que solo los compara con Dios. ¿Cuál es lo único que nos separa a ti y a mí de Dios? Que Dios nos puede dar la vida o nos la puede quitar. Pues bien, Fidel Castro nos puede dar la vida o nos la puede quitar.
Fidel Castro's private life was almost never discussed in Cuba. He had at least 11 children with 7 women, including 5 with his wife Dalia. Most of his sons and daughters lived on the island.
Hijo de Papa nennt man das in Kuba, also Vaterssöhnchen oder Vaterstöchterchen. Na, die werden schon in gewisser Weise abgeschottet leben auf Kuba. Also, dass möglichst die Masse der Bevölkerung nicht erfährt, wie es ihnen sozusagen gut geht.
Pictures of Fidel Castro's children are rare. The eldest son, Fidelito, Alejandro, Antonio, Alex, Angel, and Lena.
Y entonces, esos muchachos crecieron al margen del poder, dentro del poder, pero al margen de las decisiones del poder. Y quizás tanta presencia y tanta omnipresencia de Fidel los hizo rechazar las posiciones públicas o las posiciones políticas. Yo creo que ellos prefieren salir en yate, ellos prefieren pasear, ellos prefieren disfrutar una Cuba y los recursos que una Cuba que sienten que por derecho les toca.
Hasta la victoria siempre.
What would a Cuba without Fidel Castro look like? An accident in October of 2004 made the question more pertinent.
2004 war ja eine Veranstaltung in Santa Clara und möglicherweise durch den Regen vorher war der Abgang von der Tribüne etwas glitschig und da ist er gestürzt. Aber so gestürzt, dass er also Verletzungen davongetragen hat, die es ihm nicht mehr ermöglichten, seine Ämter auszuüben.
Since the revolution of 1959, the question of who rules the island was clear for most Cubans. But of the top revolutionary leaders from back then, only the Castro brothers survived to this day. Raúl Castro has been president of Cuba since 2008. He has chosen not to deviate from most of his brother's policies.
Und deshalb hat wahrscheinlich, solange die beiden Castros leben, nie jemand auch nur eine solche Forderung gestellt, das schon gar nicht. Und es ist auch nie ein Anführer oder eine Führungspersönlichkeit gekommen, die das hätte streitig machen können.
Raúl took over his brother's duties, first temporarily, then permanently. He became president at the age of 75. Juan Almeida, after his parents divorced, lived for several years with Raúl Castro.
Bueno, te puedo decir que yo lo quise muchísimo, fue un hombre que yo adoré, era para mí mi segundo padre. Te puedo decir que es un hombre familiar.
Raúl's wife, Vilma Espín, was herself a veteran of the revolution and a former member of the Council of State. Since Fidel kept his own family out of the spotlight, Vilma Espín was called Cuba's First Lady until her death in 2007. She and Raúl had 4 children, in addition to their foster son, Juan.
Raúl se mandó a hacer un traje de mariscal que le quedaba muy bien. De hecho, cuando los hijos de Raúl o las personas que vivíamos con él le queríamos pedir algo y que nos lo concediera, pues era muy fácil adularlo diciéndole: qué bien te queda el traje de mariscal.
Raúl is a Marxist, is a communist, is an admirer of the Soviet Union, has been, if you go to his office, you see pictures of all the generals of World War II, the Soviet generals.
Above all else, Raúl Castro ensured the Army's grasp on power. Under his leadership, the military controlled large parts of Cuba's economy and foreign trade.
Raúl no le gustan las cámaras, a Raúl no le gusta el público, Raúl padece de agorafobia, Raúl padece de muchas cosas a las que le sobraban a Fidel.
Cuban politics did not change with Raúl in charge. Fidel was no longer involved in day-to-day politics, but he remained the symbol of highest authority. Here, he is visited in the hospital by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez.
Ich habe dann teilgenommen an der Parade, einer Militärparade zu Ehren von Fidel Castro. Haben alle geglaubt, er würde kommen, aber es war damals eben so, dass es seinen Gesundheitszustand nicht erlaubt hat. Ich habe überhaupt festgestellt, das Volk war erschüttert, dass Fidel krank ist.
Official appearances guarantee public applause.
Esto que le está pasando ahora, que está metido en su casa, que no puede salir y que no puede mandar, eso debe ser el peor castigo para Fidel Castro. No poder mandar, no poder hacer nada. Uf, yo me imagino que debe tener un genio. Terrible.
Venezuela's president, Hugo Chavez, died of cancer in 2013. Cuba lost one of its chief allies. The low cost of oil further hampers Cuba's chances of continuing to receive oil under Chavez's successors.
Venezuela economically going down is the only support that they had. Venezuela was giving Cuba over 100,000 barrels of oil a day for free, of which they use half, and half they sell it in the international market. So as soon as the market went down, like it did, to $8 or $10 a barrel, whatever they sold in the market was nothing. I mean, they lost a tremendous amount of income.
In the fall of 2015, Pope Francis visited Cuba. "60% of Cuba's population is Catholic, even though the country is officially atheist.
Dann ist innerhalb der Krise, also ab Ende der 80er, Anfang der 90er Jahre, hat die katholische Kirche wieder Zug um Zug durch die Beschäftigung mit den einfachen Leuten, Medikamentenverteilung, Hilfe, soziale Betreuung, hat wieder nach und nach an Boden gewonnen und ist, glaube ich, heute ein wichtiger Faktor.
The remaining incarcerated members of Cuba's opposition movements were allowed to leave Cuba for Spain, thanks to the mediation of the Catholic Church. But their relatives among the ladies in white were briefly interned themselves during the papal visit.
Animo a los responsables políticos a continuar avanzando por este camino y a desarrollar todas sus potencialidades como prueba del alto servicio que están llamados a prestar en favor de la paz y el bienestar de sus pueblos y de toda América, y como ejemplo de reconciliación para el mundo entero.
Pope Francis is originally from Argentina. Even before his visit, he used his influence to mediate between Cuba and the United States.
Francisco ha pedido no solo que cambie esa realidad, sino que se implicó él mismo en el proceso de negociación para desarticular esos mecanismos y que Cuba y Estados Unidos pudieran sentarse en una mesa a negociar y luego a normalizar su relación.
Fidel Castro, a former Jesuit student, meets Jesuit Pope Francis. The two men spoke Spanish and got on well. Castro had opposed the church for a long time, even banning Christmas from Cuba during the Cold War. But those days are behind him.
Ein Mann wie Fidel, der braucht gar keine Ämter, der strahlt auch ohne eine Uniform oder ein Gewand. Er ist eben die moralische Instanz, er ist der Übervater und wird auch als solcher immer noch anerkannt.
Socialist organizations helped to ensure a maximum turnout for the papal masses in Cuba. It was a quid pro quo, as the Pope had behind the scenes and long before his visit worked to reconcile Cuba and the United States.
Das Ziel des Papstbesuches war, Kuba zu besuchen, aber unter den Verhandlungen wird das ein wichtiger Punkt gewesen sein. Und der ist ja insofern erfolgreich, dass sowohl die USA wie auch Kuba das als Erfolg verbuchen können.
After decades of animosity, and with the mediation of Pope Francis, U.S. President Barack Obama sees the opportunity to make history, to end the United States' isolation in Latin America. And even in Cuba, the need for a new era is apparent.
Even the whole opening of relations with the United States isn't because they think they lose anything. Everybody in their intelligence service is saying this is a good thing. Politically, financially, Cuba comes out the winner. Why wouldn't they do it?
April of 2015 marked the first time that the presidents of Cuba and the United States had met since the Cuban Revolution.
Seit Anfang der 60er Jahre wirklich hat man im Prinzip ein halbes Jahrhundert, wo die USA das Feindbild sind. Und dann hat man eine Situation, wo Raúl und Obama zeitgleich eine Pressekonferenz geben. Das ist abgesprochene Politik. Das ist nicht mehr das Feindbild kommt ein ganzes Stück weit ins Wanken.
A handshake was staged for the TV cameras. The first concrete result of this Cuban thaw was the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba by Secretary of State John Kerry. Diplomatic relations had been cut in 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The embassy was shut down in 1963. In 2015, the same U.S. Marines who hauled down the U.S. flag back then brought it back to Cuba, handing it to their young successors. For a former advisor to U.S. President John F. Kennedy, it was an event that had been a long time coming.
The United States politics for all the years since then and until Obama acted were among the worst and silliest things that any country had done. Here we're recognizing China, Russia, you name some of the worst regimes. And little Cuba is the place where we keep focusing politically that no, you can't do anything with Cuba.
But many, especially companions from Cuba's former communist allies, are not convinced by the apparent rapprochement.
Ich denke, Kuba meint das ehrlich und braucht auch die Zusammenarbeit mit allen, auch mit den USA. Ob diese Ehrlichkeit auch auf Seiten der USA zu spüren ist, das kann ich nicht sagen. Ich bin da etwas misstrauisch. Ich denke eher, die Politik der USA besteht darin, Kuba in der Umarmung zu erdrücken.
Since the 1990s, money transfers from exiled Cubans to their families on the island have been Cuba's main source of foreign currency. Now, Cubans hope for more tourism, an end to the U.S. embargo, and investments from American companies. And perhaps in the distant future, the end of the American presence at Guantanamo.
Was in diesen wirklich extremst komplizierten Fragen, was sich da in den nächsten Jahren bewegen kann, Eigentumsfragen, Guantanamo, Rückgabe, Schulden, kann ich mir einfach nicht vorstellen, was sich da bewegen soll.
No quiere decir que nosotros nos vayamos de aquí adelante a dar besos con Estados Unidos y que todo va a ser muy suave, muy dulce y va a ser una panacea. Va a haber sus confrontaciones, va a haber sus problemas. Lo que hay es que tratar de tener la voluntad política de avanzar.
In Washington, the negotiations with Cuba are not without criticism. Despite their mishandling of Cuba's economy, the Castro brothers are seen as having won their Cold War.
And we see their arrogance back again now with who's leading their negotiations with the United States. Josefina Vidal, who he threw out for espionage in 2003, and Gustavo Machin, her deputy, who we threw out for the Ana Montes espionage case. I think that is classic Castro brothers. They could have picked anybody in the world to be the front men. And they picked two spies.
Both sides hope to benefit in the long term. For now, humanitarian issues, such as the delivery of medicines and regulating visits, are the main concerns.
The message our president has sent to everyone is the Cubans are not a threat. And so it will make it even easier for them. They can steal everything they've wanted to steal at a reduced risk, more efficiently for any enemy of the United States. Cuba is now your greatest ally because not only do they have agents throughout the United States, Cuba has its own version of the National Security Agency. So if you're the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, if you want to know what U.S. communications are saying right now, there's only one country to go to.
Cuba eavesdrops on U.S. communications with the help of a Russian-built base on the island. It was shut down in 2001, only to be put back online in 2014. Today, 3,000 Russian technicians maintain the base, which is directed at the United States. Cuba sells the fruits of its eavesdropping on the international market to the tune of an estimated $100 million a year. A spy base does not seem conducive to a continued Cuban thaw. The future of this spy base will show in which allies Cuba places stock in the future. This will likely be left for Castro's successors to decide. Raúl Castro has announced that he will step down in 2018.
El modelo que para regir el país ya no funciona. Es decir, yo tengo un hermano que tiene 17 años. Ese hermano de 17 años, tú le hablas de la revolución o le hablas de la iconografía revolucionaria y es extraño a todo eso, ¿entiendes? Con él tú puedes hablar de la Liga Europea de Fútbol o de Pitbull y él va a saber perfectamente quién es uno y quién es otro. De lo otro está desconectado.
Revolutionary language apparently no longer appeals to young Cubans. But what comes next?
Yo tengo mucha confianza en la juventud, mucha confianza en los que nacieron después de la revolución, que no tienen ningún compromiso con la revolución de 1959, que no tienen ningún recuerdo romántico de esa revolución, no tienen ninguna ligazón con ese proceso y que quieren sencillamente democracia y prosperidad en nuestro país.
Cuba's youth will be left with the unenviable task of shaping their country's future between revolutionary nostalgia and the need for change.
No podemos pensar que los jóvenes sean igual que nosotros. Pienso que van a defender al país, van a defender lo que tienen, con la característica que tengan en ese momento. Porque han pasado 50 años, cuando empezamos a defenderla no era así. Cuando nosotros empezamos a defender lo que queríamos que fuera nuestra patria, era tirando piedra en huelga, de hambre, fajado con la policía, con el ejército, y después fajado a tiro. Ahora no. Ahora tienen otras cuestiones, forma de defenderla. Y según vaya pasando el tiempo, irá transformándose eso. Pero seguramente la defenderán. Yo no tengo ninguna duda de eso.
Already, access to U.S. television, cell phones, and albeit limited, to the internet, shows that Cuba's government can no longer decide what Cubans have a right to know.
Aquí al lado, ¿entiendes? Queramos o no queramos, la sociedad de consumo norteamericana atrae mucho a la gente, porque creen que todo el mundo va a vivir igual y no se dan cuenta que ni en los mismos Estados Unidos, con los mismos americanos, viven igual.
Falta mucho por alcanzar en ese sentido en Cuba. Por ejemplo, yo creo que un uso pleno y abierto de Internet es una necesidad, no solamente para las personas, es una necesidad para la sociedad cubana en general. Creo que es una sociedad que está retrasada con respecto a su tiempo por ese nivel de acceso a las nuevas tecnologías tan limitado que tenemos, pero que es importante en estos cambios que se han producido. La sociedad cubana, hasta tanto no tenga un uso realmente dinámico de las posibilidades de las nuevas tecnologías, es como si estuviéramos viviendo todavía en el siglo XX.
The days of the Castro brothers are coming to an end. An entire country is waiting for what comes next.
Yo creo que no se pueden cambiar 54 años en 6 meses. Yo creo que la primera fecha que vamos a ver y podemos hablar ya de cambios reales va a ser en el 2018, que Raúl Castro ha dicho que termina su mandato. Ahí tenemos que ver quién es el sucesor, qué organismos se crean, la sociedad civil, qué mecanismos empieza a imponer, pero no, yo sí creo que estamos en un momento de cambio importante, interesante y que además hay que estimular.
Yo creo que va a suceder es que cuando desaparezcan los dos ancianos va a haber un proceso muy acelerado de cambio y de reformas que liquidará ese capitalismo militar de Estado. Y probablemente ahí haya un enfrentamiento, como siempre ocurre en cualquier estructura de poder, entre los más ortodoxos, los más reformistas, los que quieren cambios más rápidos, los que se producirá un conflicto inevitablemente.
Most Cuba experts believe that the island's next leader will arise from within the old political and military apparatus. Whether this leader will be willing to make democratic or economic reforms remains to be seen. For centuries, the inhabitants of the largest island in the Caribbean have dreamt the dream of freedom. While their homes suffered under the yoke of foreign masters, Spain and the United States. Time and time again, saviors and saints arose, spread hope, and failed. Heroes turned to tyrants, hungry for power and wealth. For Cubans, a new era will begin in 2018. With so many unanswered questions left, tensions or even conflicts, it seems, will be inevitable. But Cubans on the island, as well as abroad, share one overwhelming hope: that this time, history will not repeat itself.